Behind every military operation is intelligence. You can't attack something you don't know about, and you certainly have no hope of winning a war without it. Japan had no chance of winning World War II regardless, but the failure and mismanagement of its intelligence services didn't help them. However, the deficiencies in Imperial Japan's intelligence capabilities were more complicated than it may seem, and they didn't appear overnight. The beginnings of Japanese military intelligence can be traced to the late 1800s. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy developed their intelligence apparatuses separately, and these were hardly formal institutions early on. Often, intelligence gathering would consist of simply asking Japanese citizens residing in the country of residence for any relevant information they could provide. In 1890, the IJA officer Sei Arai established the Institute for Sino-Japanese Trade, one of the first Japanese organizations created with intelligence gathering as a main objective. This was in preparation for Japan's planned war with China, what would be the first Sino-Japanese War. The Chinese army was much larger than Japan's, but through gathered insights, Japan was able to identify key deficiencies and weak points in their forces and ultimately deliver a relatively quick and decisive defeat. A few years later, Japanese attention turned north to Russia. The IJN by this point had formalized its intelligence networks into the vaguely named Third Department, bringing all its foreign intelligence gathering under one roof. The army, however, had largely kept operating in the same manner as before, and was disinclined to change its ways on the eve of a war with Imperial Russia. Still, the not very official networks the army used came up with a similar assessment as the one for China. A protracted war with Russia was unlikely to be winnable, but quick, decisive strikes before Russian logistics could catch up may secure a Russian defeat. This again proved true, and Japan won a surprising victory that Imperial Russia would never really recover from. Japanese planners and intelligence officers followed what is generally referred to as the Prussian model of warfare, emphasizing swift tactical defeats. Japanese strategists forewent the idea of total war that was taking shape at the start of the 20th century, a mistake that would prove catastrophic. After the Russo-Japanese War, the army would finally begin to form a proper organized intelligence service, primarily the Second Department under the Army General Staff, mainly focused on codebreaking. These early technical efforts, contrary to much of the popular conceptions about Japanese intelligence operations, were quite advanced. By the 1920s, they had fully broken the diplomatic ciphers and partially broken the military ciphers of the UK, US, and China. By collecting ciphered documents from the Soviet Union and sending them to Poland, they were also often able to read Soviet diplomatic cables. The Soviet Union was almost always the Japanese Army's top priority for signals intelligence, even into World War II. In the 1930s, however, the Soviet security apparatus began developing, as well as its cryptography departments. Soviet codemakers were now coming up with new systems all the time, and while many could be cracked after varying intervals of time, this meant it now took much longer, relatively, for collected communications to be turned into anything actionable, and the accuracy was often lacking. Often, as part of an intelligence agreement with Germany, Japan would give Germany decrypted British and American messages in exchange for decrypted Soviet ones. These issues contributed to Japan's eventual defeat in the Soviet-Japanese border war. At the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, the IJA was able to decrypt Soviet Air Force codes, but not those of the Red Army, who had amassed a force 4 times as large as estimated. Intelligence had instead focused on locating key Soviet positions, believing this knowledge could allow them to win the conflict quickly, completely missing the sheer overwhelming force Japan had to contend with. After the border war, Soviet forces would adopt a new, much more secure system that Japan wouldn't be able to reliably decrypt until 1944. Japanese troubles with Soviet codes would extend into their war with China as well. Japan was able to break the ciphers of the KMT government easily, but struggled with those used by communist guerrillas. Soviet cryptographers aided them in creating secure ciphers, and communist leaders were particularly diligent in frequently changing the codes. Japan did largely crack the system by 1941, but couldn't always read communist communications. I mentioned before about cracked British and American ciphers. The IJA struggled against their priority target of the Soviet Union, but the IJN saw some success against their priorities, the UK and the US. The Navy's code-breaking abilities were considerable, and they were able to defeat many early American ciphers, though the US wasn't really giving much effort to developing strong codes at this time. The Department of State's Gray Code and Brown Code were both broken shortly after their introductions in the 1920s and 30s respectively. These easy systems would eventually be replaced with the sophisticated strip ciphers. After a very long and laborious process, Japan was eventually able to crack them, a feat British and German efforts were never able to achieve. This allowed them to read much of American diplomatic and military communications. Japan was quick to capitalize on this, even posting a special converted oiler near Hawaii to pick up US Navy radio traffic. Japan went a step further around 1938, setting up a listening post in Mexico capable of picking up signals from Washington, D.C. and New York, giving Japan insight into both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets. The relative ease with which Japan was able to break early American ciphers wouldn't continue when it came to cracking British ciphers, however. British diplomatic codes were extremely difficult to break and would take Japanese codebreakers years of effort. There was some major progress in 1934 when they got their hands on a British diplomatic codebook. This was acquired by having a Japanese typist working for the British consulate in Sapporo literally throw it out the window when nobody was looking. British officials changed their encryption systems in 1935, however, making these efforts useless. Japan kept at it, however, and sometime around 1940 they were able to reliably decrypt British diplomatic cables, allowing Japanese planners to discover in early 1941 that defenses around Malaya and Singapore were particularly weak. Almost all of Japanese code-related efforts, however, were focused on cracking, and their own ciphers were fairly underdeveloped. The IJN is believed to have only used 2 ciphers leading up to and during World War II. Both of these could be somewhat reliably cracked by British and American intelligence, though the Navy was prudent enough to make small changes to the system before major operations. This meant operations like Pearl Harbor were still surprises to Allied forces. The Navy was complacent about their operational security and often believed their codes simply could not be cracked. The updated system they were using post-Pearl Harbor was indeed somewhat difficult to break, but this complacency meant codebooks were rarely changed and often used improperly, letting American cryptographers break it just before the consequential Battle of Midway. Midway was famously won by American intelligence, who discovered when and where the Japanese Navy was planning an ambush. The battle was a crippling defeat for Japan, and the root cause was a lack of Japanese operational security. The Navy recognized this, writing in the official operations log, "The enemy had grasped our intentions beforehand regarding the battle." While the Admiralty did their best to cover up the disastrous nature of the defeat, they also took the opportunity to blame just about anything else besides their codes. Consequently, the Navy failed to make any significant adjustments to their approach. The IJA was aware of the vulnerabilities in the Navy's codes, but the inter-service rivalry between the Army and Navy meant this information wasn't shared until 1943. The two branches never developed any sort of interdepartmental mechanism for sharing intelligence, and in fact generals and admirals would often sabotage any efforts to establish one. This would often lead to duplication of effort, with the two branches having to both spend resources on achieving the exact same intelligence goals. It also didn't help that the Foreign Ministry, which gathered some intelligence of its own, would rarely share any of it with the military. Part of the reason for this dysfunction was how intelligence was viewed by the military. Intelligence services were seen as lesser, and those who worked in them were often seen as nothing more than messenger boys. Intelligence was seen as a temporary position for most people, or as a punishment assignment. Consequently, intelligence departments were either understaffed or had staff ill-suited for the job. Military leaders often disregarded intelligence provided to them entirely, or cherry-picked information from reports to make it conform to their own objectives and ideas. It was extremely rare for the military to consider the opinion of intelligence in any capacity beyond an immediate tactical need, though there were some notable exceptions. In 1940, Japan was able to read the diplomatic communications of France, Britain, the US, and China. Shortly after the fall of Paris, Japan began eyeing their holdings in Indochina. French Indochina had been a key route for Allied aid to flow to China, a route which Japan was eager to cut. Through deciphered diplomatic cables, Japan learned no country was in a position, or had a desire to, attempt a defense of Indochina. So, before French authorities could attempt to muster some kind of force locally, or China could move a significant force into the region, Japan just took it. The operation was a huge success, and Japan pretty much just walked right in with little resistance. There was actually supposed to be no resistance, since just a day before the invasion happened, France signed an agreement allowing Japan to take over military infrastructure in the territory. The army, however, was not informed of this, and fighting broke out during the operation. Part of the issue was that the IJA's intelligence priority was still the Soviet Union, and it would take the disaster at Guadalcanal in 1943 for that to change. From the outset, Japanese intelligence was completely wrong, believing there were only around 1,000 American troops on the island, when in reality there were 20,000. Part of the issue was the Army's reluctance to send any reports to the intelligence staff, creating a feedback loop of both intelligence and operational commanders going off faulty information. Still, the IJA finally changed its priorities and began bringing in specialists in American and British intelligence on board. The IJN's specialists were busy coordinating with German intelligence to make a significant breakthrough, cracking BAMS. BAMS, or the Broadcast to Allied Merchant Shipping, was a radio system used to coordinate the movement of merchant ships during the war. The German raiding ship Atlantis had captured a codebook for BAMs and shared this with Japan, who was able to use it to somewhat reliably decipher the radio transmissions. Merchant traffic would typically increase sharply in a particular region about a month before an American operation would be launched, so the Navy could often predict general Allied movements. This success was undercut by a dramatic failure, however. The Navy's internal telegrams were being read by American intelligence, who managed to pick up one detailing the exact itinerary and upcoming movements of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the IJN's top admiral. Based on this information, American fighters were sent to intercept his plane, ultimately killing him. Yamamoto's death was a major blow to the military and to national morale, all caused by an intelligence failure. The Navy investigated the incident, but ultimately decided it was simply an unlucky accident. It was only after his death that the Army and Navy would hold regular meetings to exchange information and intelligence they had gathered, in 1943. The military, along with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, would also establish the Cipher Security Committee to improve their communications security. This cooperation would only last about a year, however, as in October of 1944, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle of World War II, the two branches formed a policy of non-exchange. The Army and Navy abruptly ceased sharing information, leading to both getting an inaccurate picture of what was going on. The issues began a week before Leyte Gulf itself, with a major air battle around Taiwan. American aircraft carriers launched an extensive strike campaign against Japanese military infrastructure on the island, to reduce pressure on the upcoming operation to liberate the Philippines. The operation was a success, with most Japanese airfields and planes on Taiwan being destroyed. A few American cruisers escorting the carriers were damaged, but no American ships were sunk. But that wasn't the official story. The Imperial headquarters falsely reported 19 American aircraft carriers and 4 battleships were sunk in the engagement, a report that was given to the Navy. The Navy's own intelligence doubted this, and intercepted American communications reported no sinkings. The Admiralty, however, was really wanting to engage in a decisive battle with the US Navy, and so opted to believe the report from Imperial headquarters instead. This alternative report wasn't shared with the Army, who were making preparations to defend the Philippine Islands themselves. Thus, the IJA shifted its planned strategy from an extensive in-depth defense on Luzon Island to a focused defense on the beaches at Leyte. The Army believed the Navy would win the battle easily, and thus any American landing force would be weak and repelled with little effort. By the time the IJA realized the scale of the American attacks they were facing, it was too late, and the forces sent to reinforce the Leyte garrison were destroyed in transit by American air power the Army believed did not exist. The two branches, unsurprisingly, blamed each other for the defeat. The Navy claimed the plan all along was for the Army to draw US forces into a lengthy battle on land where their naval forces could be destroyed. The Army claimed it was always the Navy's responsibility to prevent a landing in the first place. The Army did have one crucial intelligence development at this time, that being the creation of a system for tracking the movement of American B-29 bombers. Using IBM calculation computers seized from Japanese insurance companies, a ton of mathematics students from Tokyo Imperial University, and a complex system of punch cards, the system could predict the location of B-29s around 80% of the time. The exact impact this had on American air losses is hard to determine, but numerous shootdowns over Japan and occupied China were credited to this system. The computers even tracked the Enola Gay and Boxcar, the two planes that dropped nuclear bombs on Japan, though the word nuclear wasn't deciphered until days after the strikes. Those are some of the major pieces of Japanese signals intelligence during the war, but there's a whole other piece of the story we're missing: human intelligence. Human intelligence, or HUMINT, is the more traditional side of things, involving classic espionage and spying, but also things like psychological operations and surveillance. HUMINT was viewed much more favorably by the military establishment, though it was still treated as secondary and a lesser position to work in. Most Japanese HUMINT activities were under the same special departments mentioned earlier, but many were also organized by separate special duty agencies. Just like with signals and cryptography, activities were split between the Army and Navy. The priorities were the same as well. The Army focused on the Soviet Union, running espionage operations throughout Siberia and Central Asia. The Trans-Siberian Railway was of particular interest. Agents would often be sent to ride civilian passenger trains and would log and photograph any information they could about Soviet military logistics. The IJA would also occasionally collect information from defecting or deserting Soviet soldiers crossing the border into Manchukuo. The insight provided by these defectors was often lacking or inaccurate, but it was often all Japanese human operators could go off of. This was due to the USSR's extensive internal counterintelligence apparatus, which Japan was never really able to overcome. Japan didn't attempt large-scale infiltrations of the Soviet Union, as the few spies they sent would often return as Soviet double agents. Japanese army officers eventually developed a somewhat joking internal policy to not trust anyone who claimed to know a lot about the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Navy was focusing on the United States and Britain. In the UK, Japan interestingly prioritized recruiting famous people such as Frederick Rutland, a famed World War I pilot and expert in aircraft carrier development. He lived in Japan for a time, helping design Japan's aircraft carriers. He was sent to California in the 30s to gather information about the American Pacific Fleet and the level of aircraft production happening in the state. He may have also briefly had contact with Takeo Yoshikawa, another Japanese agent operating in Hawaii. Yoshikawa had arrived in Hawaii under a fake name and with a cover story of being a diplomat. He was ordered to join civilian tours around Oahu starting in January 1941 as part of the planning for the attack on Pearl Harbor. He meticulously logged US Navy traffic at Pearl Harbor, and his photographs and data would be instrumental in planning the eventual attack. Many of Yoshikawa's reports were sent back to Japan via regular diplomatic channels, but he was also helped by Bernard Kuhn, a German Abwehr agent. Kuhn set up a system of light signals at his house in Hawaii that would relay information to Japanese submarines about recent US fleet movements. Kuhn's information was mentioned in Japanese documents captured a few months later, and he was arrested and deported after the war for being a spy. Kuhn had been under suspicion by the police for some time, partly because he had no cover story. There was no real reason for him to be in Hawaii. Japanese conspirators would be more careful in Hong Kong, where an extensive subversive scheme was being planned. It's often forgotten that December 7, 1941 saw more attacks than just the one at Pearl Harbor. It was a coordinated strike against a huge number of sites in the Greater Pacific. The Kowa-Kikan, or Asia Development Agency, was established in Hong Kong and Guangzhou in early 1941. This organization was established with two goals, one being to monitor British and American naval traffic, and the other being to support the Japanese army when they moved into the region. Japanese officers worked with local triad gangs to build bombs and engage in sabotage operations against British military installations and infrastructure in Hong Kong. They also dug a tunnel across the border into Hong Kong to facilitate the IJA's eventual advance. The Kowa-Kikan's most important action, however, was seizing Hong Kong's main water reservoirs during the Battle of Hong Kong. The lack of water was one of the biggest contributing factors to the eventual surrender of British forces. After the fall of Hong Kong, these conspirators relocated to Chongqing, the temporary capital of the nationalist Chinese government. Here they printed propaganda leaflets as well as counterfeit currency in hopes of destabilizing the government. It isn't clear what happened to this group after the war, though they allegedly engaged in smuggling operations during the US occupation of Japan. There's one country, sort of country, I haven't talked about that Japan was also interested in, the Dutch East Indies. Rich in natural resources and occupying a key location, as well as hosting plenty of military infrastructure, the Indonesian archipelago was another target for Japan. Japan didn't have much of an intelligence network in the country until 1940, after the fall of the European Netherlands. One of Japan's main tactical objectives was to seize the oil refinery at Palembang. This was ultimately accomplished with a risky airborne assault which required precise intelligence to pull off. Around April 1941, Japanese agents were sent to collect information on the site, gathering data about production levels, stockpiles, and crucially stealing aerial photographs that had been taken by private oil companies. This greatly helped the operation's eventual success, and similar operations in Indonesia would also assist the invading Japanese. Propagandists embedded amongst Indonesian nationalist groups who were fighting the Dutch convinced many to support the Japanese landings as well as sabotage Dutch defenses. Part of the reason this was so effective was the failure of the local Dutch authorities to collaborate with their allies. They were extremely distrustful of British and American intelligence agencies, and as such, the meager local operatives they had were unable to apprehend Japanese infiltrators. Across the Pacific, however, Japan had a perhaps even more daring objective. Japan always needed to track Allied ship movements on a wider scale, and often sent agents to the Panama Canal zone to monitor ship traffic as well as gather information about the defenses there. Mostly it was plainly useful to know how many ships were using the canal, but the data collected was also being used for a planned attack. Japan had come up with an ambitious plan to prevent the use of the Panama Canal by bombing its locks. This would have been achieved by submarines of the I-400 class, a special class capable of carrying aircraft. These were the largest submarines in the world for around 20 years. Japanese planners had devised this plan around 1942 or 43 after getting information from POWs that American security at the canal was lax and that chances of an attack there were considered very low. Tests performed by the Navy showed it was feasible, and there was a decent chance of success given American security was indeed low. However, by the time the I-400 submarines entered service, it was already 1945, and the war was over before the operation could be carried out. As mentioned, POWs were often a source of information for Japan. Imperial Japan was notorious for the torture they used in extracting information, but as always, torture is a terrible way of going about this, and more nuanced, restrained approaches were more effective. A particularly skilled interrogator at the Ofuna POW camp in Kanagawa was able to piece together a very accurate map and schedule of American submarine patrols by striking up casual conversations at mealtimes, for example. POW interrogations, as with so much of Japanese intelligence, was fragmented and only sometimes effective. While intelligence did allow them to occasionally win tactical victories, the broader strategic picture was missed. At times, there were impressive technical breakthroughs and successes, but intelligence was ultimately seen as secondary. Systemic inefficiencies, internal rivalries, and the military's disregard for it resulted in an incoherent apparatus. The war's outcome would not have been changed by a competent intelligence service, but the one Japan ended up with certainly didn't help it.
おかけになった相手先電話番号ではおつなぎできません。番号をお確かめの上おかけ直しください。